bigger divide is what to do with him now. He escaped to Russia. Russia has offered him asylum. There was some debate about where he would fly over, if he could fly through international zones. They were trying to calculate a route through all the different countries to get him to a country that didn't support the US so that he could stay there. Big problems like these cause international divides, and we don't have an effective way to deal with these criminals. An effective way and a fair way. That is why we are proud to propose the motion that this House believes that the International Criminal Court should have the authority to investigate and prosecute any cases. Our model has 3 prongs. The first is that they will set up international criminal tribunals to deal with individual branches of violations. For example, a court for specific human rights violations or environmental violations. These courts have had precedent being set up multiple times to deal with individual human rights violations. Second, they would have the authority to be the primary investigation and prosecutor on any allegation of crimes that cross national borders. To be clear, this includes violations of international law under UN treaties, because this is an international matter. 3, they will have the authority to investigate and prosecute any cases that are appealed from the highest court of a sovereign nation. So if one of the parties believes that the decision was unfair, they can appeal that court to the ICC, and then they will have the authority to decide whether or not to investigate and then whether or not to prosecute. To be clear again, that prosecution for the 3rd prong will be based on the laws of the sovereign country. Because if it was to be based on international law, it would have been appealed under the 2nd prong. If it is unjust, then they already would have appealed it. Again, to be clear, this is not double jeopardy. It is just one punishment, and the decision will override in the same way that if an appeals court overrides something, the highest court of the land can overturn their decision. And the last point is that this is authority. Side opposition might miss that the point is that they have the authority to prosecute the cases, not that they will prosecute every single individual appeal that they get or every single individual violation of every treaty. Obviously, this will be a process, but side proposition strongly believes that this is a result that is worth working towards, and so we propose the motion today. We will present 3 points in support of the motion. The first, that this is a more fair and more consistent way to prosecute cases in the individual case. The second is that this is a more effective way to investigate and prosecute cases in each individual case. And the third, which my second speaker will talk about, is that this fosters constructive engagement in the international community, aside from each individual case being prosecuted. Now on our first point, that the model leads to more consistent and more fair application of the law. We start with the basic assumption that every human being holds the same fundamental value, the same rights. Nothing, place of birth, color of skin, sex, or gender should distinguish between people. That on an individual worth level, they're all the same. If that's the case, then the status quo has a lot of things to answer for, and side opposition has a lot of things to answer for. They have to answer for how different political pressures insert certain people into situations where they can do nothing wrong and still be prosecuted. For example, Cuba's political system can have people held responsible for future crimes. Their definition of dangerousness is if at any point, or if now or at any point, this thing could have been construed to have been dangerous, then you can be put in jail for your life, and a prison camp will kill you in an average of 6 years. These people are not being given their fair and equal rights, and those decisions need to be able to be appealed. These differences as who matters and who doesn't are principally unfair and arbitrary. The different backgrounds and influence decisions that should be fair and based on fact are also arbitrary. The same standard should be applied to determine equal fundamental right to access certain values. In addition, because we are all human beings, it is most important that people are given the same fundamental respect. This has been a concern for centuries. The concern of extraterritoriality was a big issue in the colonial era when other countries started to invade and colonize other areas. In the Opium War, a big justification in China, between China and a lot of Western powers, including England specifically, there was a huge conflict over the issue of extraterritoriality. Who got to prosecute people who committed crimes, foreigners who committed crimes in China? International treaties constantly included clauses about that. This is an issue of such international contention, the decision should be the same. It shouldn't be one country getting to force their opinion on the other one outside of an international arena that everyone can cooperate under. It's the same body.
Information.
But also, because we are all equal and deserve the same ability to reach equal rights, to protect ourselves, we need to stop the violations that human rights present. And that brings me to my second point, which is that the International Criminal Court has the most effective way, is a more effective way to investigate and prosecute cases. One of the big arguments that we hear a lot against the UN when it is meant to be a solution to something, is that it has no bite, that there's no force. People make fun of it for not being competent.
On that point, ma'am.
The answer to this is the ICC. The ICC should be the UN's bite. Yes.
The ICC has prosecuted over hundreds of individuals and has convicted one.
That's because we're advocating that the ICC should be expanded. We agree, right now the ICC is not where it should be, but we see an institution that has a lot of potential. Also, that statistic doesn't include the international criminal tribunals that are they're not outside of the ICC, but they're like individual branches of the ICC, so the ICC will create an individual criminal tribunal to deal with certain cases. In the case of Rwanda and the Rwanda genocide, the Nuremberg trials, and the case in Yugoslavia, they prosecuted dictators and investigated them. They spent 2 years investigating for the Nuremberg trials to make sure they had all the right evidence, that they weren't prosecuting the wrong people. This excellently to the next part of my second point. There are better investigations under UN treaties. There isn't as much pressure to come out with a certain answer. It's about finding the right answer, about finding justice, because that's the only reason that the court exists. There isn't a bias. And this is the proper bite for the UN to have, because it's not an issue of dominance, it's not an issue of having an army or asserting authority. It's an issue of preventing people from doing things that violate the basic human rights that we all support. In addition, there's a lack of political bias and a lack of a risk of political bias in the UN, at least comparative to sovereign nations. Russia is a good example of this right now. Right now, Putin through Medvedev are prosecuting all of their political opponents. They're putting people in prison for embezzlement with very little evidence because they're putting so much pressure on the court. Those decisions are unfair, there's no fair justice system to deal with them, and those people can't influence the UN the same way that they can influence their own countries. Those decisions can be appealed to the UN under our plan. In addition, there's a lack of media bias in the UN as opposed to in individual cases. In the United States, all the time, there will be a ton of media surrounding an issue that will bias jury members before something else, whereas you have more qualified justices, and the UN can come up with a more qualified way of determining issues rather than on a country-by-country basis. And even if it isn't necessarily tons better than each individual country, at least it's fair, at least it's equal. At least it reaffirms the basic principle that we all know and believe to be true, which is that we are all equal. But the biggest issue here, which I identified in my intro, is that there are a lot of questions that we just don't have answers to. Who has jurisdiction in certain issues in the world? And crimes are committed within a nation, but it's someone else from another country. Who prosecutes that? If a leader of a country is being prosecuted, is that individual country supposed to prosecute that leader? A lot of the time that doesn't happen or can't happen. Should the UN do that? Should someone else do that? Should another country do that they committed a war against? Asylum seekers, what should be done with them? Australia has been sending all their asylum seekers to Papua New Guinea. A lot of people are arguing that this is unfair or unjust that they're sent this way. How are people going to deal with this? Give strength to the UN to deal with these problems. Also, in the US, there's a clear example. They've been locking up foreign nationals in Guantanamo Bay and not giving them fair trials, not giving them this justification that the US criminal justice system is supposed to afford. If that's the case, then there should be an ICC, there should be an International Criminal Court that says, wait a second, that's not okay. Here's how we deal with these people. Here's how we should address this. Here's how we should prosecute, and here's how we should prosecute effectively. Not all legal systems are good, not all systems are fair, not all systems are equal. That is why we strongly advocate pushing towards a more equal and more fair system, and a more effective system with the International Criminal Courts. Thank you.
Okay, we will now invite for the first speaker side opposition to deliver his substantive and rebuttal.
The destruction of governments, the violation of international law, and the very basic fundamental sovereignty that every country has the right to. This is the reality of side proposition's plan today, and that is why we on side opposition clearly oppose today's motion. So today's resolution calls that the proposition defend any case when it comes to the ICC coming in and investigating or prosecuting individuals or other people. We believe that just because today's resolution states about the authority they still have to defend that the ICC has the right to come in and defend any case when it comes to local laws, petty thefts, or any kind of crime when it comes to the ICC. Furthermore, on the opposition, we take the stance that yes, the ICC can be used to prosecute individuals, but only in the cases of flagrant human rights abuses, as defined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Not every single case that side proposition needs to defend today. We have 3 points to prove this. First, that it destroys local laws and customs. Second, side proposition's plan just violates state sovereignty that should be protected. And thirdly, that the ICC would just clearly be turned into a political tool, as my partner will go through in his second speech. So before I go to side opposition's case, I'd like to go through some rebuttals. So on their first point on how the ICC is more fair and that everyone deserves the same rights and equality. However, what side proposition seems to be contradicting themselves when they say that international law, that local customs are arbitrary. Well, what is international law? What are a person's equal rights, quote unquote? These are very arbitrary terms that are defined by the international community. The same crime can be punished in many different ways in different countries in international law. So we believe that side proposition today is actually the one being arbitrary when it comes to people's rights. Furthermore, I will prove that the harms of implementing their plan clearly outweighs any kinds of benefits, even if we concede that the ICC is more fair. On their second point, on how the ICC will be more effective, on how there will be a lack of bias, somehow they'll be getting a lot of these UN benefits. First of all, addressing the UN and the ICC are two individual entities that have no relationship with each other, so do not let side propositions today garner any benefits from the UN. Secondly, on the point of bias, we on side opposition believe that there will actually be more bias when the ICC comes in. Because what happens is the ICC, a lot of the times, their decisions are influenced by stronger political countries. We see the example in the US, when the US actually paid off the ICC to stop investigation of US generals in relation to the Afghan war and any kind of human rights abuses in that sense. Now, with the side proposition's plan destroyed, I'd like to go to side opposition's case. Our first point on how side proposition's plan destroys local laws and customs. Because what side proposition fails to see today is that local laws and customs are obviously and oftentimes different from many other international laws. Yes?
You're completely sidestepping the model that we've set forth. Within the model, the ICC has jurisdiction over any international criminal case, not any law concerning local customs.
Yes, but this is exactly why we are saying that side proposition today is actually the one sidestepping the resolution. They have to defend that the ICC today, according to the resolution, has the authority to come in any case. And any case means any kind of local law, local custom, or any local law violation. Okay, back to our point on how these kinds of societies include cultural views, religious views. For example, in Singapore, it's actually in the law that if you do drugs or caught found with drugs, you will actually be sentenced to the death penalty. This is a huge cultural difference when it comes to international bodies deciding these arbitrary equal human rights. And by passing side proposition's plan, we're seeing that this is a clear violation and destroys these customs. We bring another example. For instance, in many Muslim countries, it is actually legal to stone women. What does this mean? When the ICC comes in and says no, they're going against the Quran. They're going against life teachings and the family teachings of all these citizens. And this is tearing the very fabric of these people's lives apart. They're attacking the institutions, the beliefs, and what makes these people human beings in their own society. What does this do? This delegitimizes the ICC. What this means is that locals actually see the ICC as a threat. They see it as the same example as the US perhaps invading Afghanistan. They see the ICC and other international organizations as foreign invaders or Western proxies. What this means is that ICC decrees will no longer be respected, which violates the very purpose that the ICC has been set up today. For example, we see in Pakistan where actually locals hate and resent any foreign aid workers when it comes to the World Health Organization or the Red Cross. Aid workers have actually been killed in Pakistan. Why? Because these organizations are seen by locals as invaders, as foreigners who have no interest in the people. What this means is they're actually undermines other international authorities as well, as I've stated in the example of the World Health Organizations, and any other organization that claims to be international and helping other people. For example, in Pakistan, polio levels actually rose and many more deaths occur. And these are the negative benefits, negative harms that side proposition is having in their plan today. What this means is the legitimacy of the ICC itself and local customs is at question, and any harms when it comes to prosecuting any cases in these laws clearly outweigh any kind of benefit side proposition attempts to bring up today. Moving on to our second point on how the ICC in their plan is violating international sovereignty. Sovereignty is a fundamental right of the government that any government should not have to give up. What does sovereignty do? It allows governments to have their own independence. It allows for government legitimacy. It allows for governments to ensure the rights of their own people. And when a government cannot even guarantee the fundamental right of determining what is just in their own society, this is clearly wrong and a violation on side proposition side today. Furthermore, this is protected by international law across the world, and by allowing side proposition to violate international law, there are a lot of negative consequences, especially when they have to prosecute local laws and not just human rights abuses that we on side opposition support. Now, when the ICC comes in and prosecutes and investigates, and when they come in and just violate local and international sovereignty, they are imposing power over these governments. They're violating the sovereignty, the very fundamental right of the people. No, yes.
You keep talking about how they have to accept any single case about local custom that comes to them, but the very nature of a court is that they can say yes and accept something, and an international criminal court isn't going to accept a small case about petty theft.
Yes, but any cases means any of these cases can still be brought up, and when the ICC has to answer these cases, that is when they are violating sovereignty. Back to my point on how this destroys legitimacy of governments. Because when the ICC comes in and clearly violates these governments' rights, for instance, if the Supreme Court recently ruled something about whether this guy should get a charge, and the ICC just comes in and says, no, this is actually what the law should actually be. What does the public think of a government? They lose confidence in the government. The government loses legitimacy. People don't obey laws anymore, they don't have any obligation, and this is violating international law. Because sovereignty, once again, is a fundamental right, and this is what international law does. It keeps countries at peace. And by blatantly violating the international law under side proposition plan, we will be only setting a dangerous precedent where international laws are not obeyed and there's only massive violence, anarchy, and chaos in the world. So for the reason of preserving our world today, vote side opposition.
We thank the speaker. Okay, we now ask for the second speaker, team proposition delivered. President.
What side opposition misses in this debate is all of the arguments about fundamental human equality. Because we believe that humans have a basic level of rights and a basic level of equality, we agree also that there needs to be some supreme authority that is always the fallback when things go wrong, that can always correct things when things are not right and when people are unjust and when courts do not act in the way that they should. What we are for is for fairness and universal equality, not arbitrary systems of law where things can go awry. Which is why we firmly agree that the ICC should have the ability and the authority to prosecute any cases. First, I will address the model. I will then respond to the two arguments that my opponents have brought up. I will then extend the first two arguments that my teammate has brought up and respond to objections, and introduce a third argument, which is that expanding the authority of the ICC will foster constructive engagement in the international community. So let's first talk about the model. They say that we must prove that there is authority in any case, but they don't understand that we have. All that our definition does is define explicitly when this authority will be used. We try to give you a better idea of the application in society. Look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the authority to investigate any case that is brought up in the US, but that doesn't mean that it will always do it. It still has to be appealed several times until it reaches that court. That's the same thing that we're suggesting for the ICC. They have the authority for any case. They have the authority for the petty cases. They have the authority for the cases on national levels, as well as the authority for the international crimes. But we're saying that it's only going to be brought up to that high of a level if it is appealed from the highest court. So when they say that we don't give them the authority, we do. But authority doesn't mean that in every situation we are acting upon that authority. So all that means is that the opportunity exists. They never tell us exactly why they just assert this. I just explained to you exactly how this will happen. But now let's look at their two arguments. The first is about local laws. They say that local laws and local customs are important. But as I've just clarified the model, we still agree, and our model allows for that. Local laws will be used at the beginning. They will be tried and tested. The only way that a local law will get up to the ICC is if the process of those trials is unfair. As we outlined in the beginning, the ICC will still use those sets of local laws in determining the verdict of the decision.
On that point.
No, thank you. They will just make sure that the trial is fair. Say they think that the jury was bad. Say they think that the judge was biased. Say they think that something about the procedure, the information allowed, was not okay, was not correct. Then they will reevaluate it using those same laws. But second, the argument that they make about stoning women as being part of the culture, well, if we think that that is part of the fabric of lives of a certain society, then that's a reason why we need to look to these international treaties about human rights. If people are saying it is okay to stone women in world opposition, then yes, that's exactly why we need something that can arbitrate these fundamental human equal rights. Because I know that maybe they say that the men in that society think that this is a part of their culture, but the women need to be protected as well. No, thank you. So then let's look to the argument that they make about sovereignty. They say that people will have no input, that this is horrible, that we'll be intervening left and right. But there are a couple problems with this. The first is that every country still has an input in international law. And that's actually what we're going to get to in the third argument, that this will only foster more interest in international law and force more cooperation and have people be more interested in having their point of view be expressed in the final output of international treaties. The second argument in this is that sovereignty is not going to be violated on a large basis, even if there is the court that decides to take the decision, for a couple of reasons. The first, do you think that an international criminal court is going to investigate whether Peter stole something from John in Syria? No, we don't have the time for that. That's ridiculous and preposterous. That would never be appealed up to such a high level. They have the authority for it, but they're not going to do it. And the second argument is that the sovereignty is not going to be violated because it has to make its way all the way up through the system before we reach the place that we will actually get to the ICC. Only if at the highest level is there still injustice and still unfairness in the procedures will we actually get to the ICC. So now let's talk about the points that my teammate brought up. The first is that it's more fair and more consistent prosecution. To this, they make no responses except the fact that it is more biased than the ICC. They give you one example where the US paid off, but there are once again some problems with this. First is that one example is not enough to discredit an entire institution. They say that in one case the US paid off, but there is tons and tons of injustice in the criminal systems. If the US could have an effect on a global institution, then what do you think they're doing at home? It's much easier to skew the trials when they don't have to respond to the international community. When it's just a localized and nationalized affair, then they have no one to answer to. They can commit abuses left and right, which is why we need this higher check. So then they ignore most of the rest of the argument, which is that humans are fundamentally equal. They never respond to this. They never respond to the fact that arbitrariness is a problem and that we need to ensure that they are respected. We give the example about Cuba and being committed for future crimes. We talk about extraterritoriality and the Opium Wars, and that was problematic because countries were trying to get their criminals back into their own homeland so they could prosecute them in a way that was away from the eyes of the world. This is a problem, and we don't see them answering this. The second talks about more effective trials, which they blatantly ignore. We talk about how they don't have the bias and they do have the time to invest in proper investigations, like the Nuremberg trials, where they made sure that even though people who had generally committed horrible crimes were given the most fair trial, they investigated their exact role. They spent time getting the right information, the right interviews, so that everything was perfectly fair. We see no answers to the ways that structurally they have more time and less bias. But then there's the third point, which is that expanding the authority of the ICC leads to constructive engagement in the international community. As our first argument speaks towards the benefits of having a consistent court with ultimate authority on the actual cases, the ICC also has positive implications on global interactions. There's very little in this world today that doesn't inspire tension, problems, and conflicts. Nations compete over military, economics, politics, technology. Almost everything turns into a race to see who is best. The ICC is one of the few places that escapes this problem. It is one of the few places where we will have to encourage cooperation because people want to have a say in the types of laws that are implemented. Members of different countries will come together and sit on juries. They will participate in the process, and they will bring them together. But more importantly, delegates from different countries will now care about the international treaties that they accept. They will spend more time making sure the laws are representative of the views that they want to be implemented. Because without the court, as we've experienced, a problem has been that people think the UN doesn't have the teeth, it doesn't have the ways of implementing it. But once we have the implementation, then the actual documents that we implement will become more important. And that is a fundamental way that we can have focus and cooperation between different countries. We need institutions that bring us together and not divide us, which is what the ICC will do. Now, the second way that the ICC's expanded authority affects constructive cooperation deals with the people in the world. In the past and present, national laws are what is feared. Criminals are only worried about their home country prosecuting them. And there are several examples of this. This is why Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, fled after he was exposed. This is why the Shah of Iran fled to the US to try to escape the harms and the problems that he might have in his own country. And this is why right now Edward Snowden is on the run, because he thinks that if he can flee, he can escape responsibility for his crimes. Without the ICC, people can get away from their problems. But with the ICC, there is no longer any place for them to hide. Because laws and treaties, as I've said, have no meaning without enforcement. And so the legitimacy and the compliance of these will increase once there is. Criminals should not only be responsible for their crime, depending on where their feet are standing and if they're in the certain country where they committed that crime. They must be responsible everywhere. So because we believe in human equality, because we believe that there needs to be an ultimate check on violations against human rights and other horrible things, and we believe that criminals should be responsible wherever they are, we formally propose the resolution that the ICC should have the authority to investigate any case.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we call the second speaker of side opposition for his speech.
Just like beautiful. Okay, let's start over. Just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, justice is in the beliefs of the beholder. In many cases, people from around the world have many different ideas and beliefs on what is justice. Now, for this reason, and many more, side opposition is proud to oppose the motion this House believes that the International Criminal Court should have the authority to investigate and prosecute any cases. Now, before I move on to the positive matter of side opposition's case, I would like to first address some of the points made by side proposition. Now, there's been some confusion in the model, so I will first address that immediately. Now, the first part about international criminal tribunals prosecuting criminals who violate human rights abuses. That is similar to what side opposition has stated, in that the ICC will be reserved for trying those who have committed flagrant human rights abuses. Now, the second part, about authorities in crimes that cross national borders, I will address in the third arguments from side opposition, that this in fact not only makes the International Criminal Court a political tool, but in fact does not guarantee justice while in fact violating local laws and customs. But not only that, their third argument, their third part of their model states that International Criminal Court will be able to accept appeals from the highest court of any sovereign nation while applying the sovereign nation's law. Now, we see a huge contradiction in side proposition's case, because while they claim to be upholding the rights of all humans around the world, the fundamental human inequality that we supposedly all enjoy, that the fairness that side proposition keeps on advocating, yet this part of their model shows that a woman from Iran prosecuted for adultery under the International Criminal Court who will follow Iran's laws means that they will still be stoned. And yet a woman who is found guilty of adultery in another country, say a country that doesn't believe in the Quran, will not receive the same punishment simply because the International Criminal Court is bound by side proposition's model to follow that sovereign nation's laws. And so in that case, you realize that this is not a court if the court does not deliver justice. You see that this court has international in its name, yet is delivering different justice to different people just depending on where their feet are standing. And yet this is exactly what side proposition is against. And so you see such a huge contradiction in their model that their model simply cannot be accepted. Now I'd like to move on to some of the points and the advantages they claim. First, that this will be a more fair trial. Again, we see that this cannot possibly be more fair when if I am from the United States and another person is from the United Arab Emirates, that we receive different treatment even in the International Criminal Court as a result of side proposition's plan. And you see that this simply does not guarantee fair treatment when you're considering an international body and an international court of law. And then we can continue to see that they claim this is more effective, that that expansion always results in more efficiency and more cases prosecuted and everything, when we see that the side proposition has not only provided no evidence, but no causal link to support the fact that just because you grow an organization, that in fact it will become more effective. And that side opposition instead points out that not only has the International Criminal Court's track record shown that it has been extremely ineffective in prosecuting the hundreds of warlords that walk through the ICC's revolving door, but we see that there are examples of Nuremberg and of other trials in Yugoslavia and Rwanda were in fact either before the ICC was founded or not associated with the ICC at all, because these regional courts are in fact not affiliated with the International Criminal Court. So when you identify the International Criminal Court's past record, and then you see side proposition's logic that expanding will equal more effectiveness, you see that side proposition has a huge hole in their case. Now finally, they claim that more constructive engagement will result from this. Now, side proposition, again, is neglecting to point out the facts of this matter. Now, first of all, side proposition claims that more countries are willing to be part of making international law, when side proposition doesn't realize that international law has already been made. And not only that, but they say that country will be interested in the prosecution of cases in the International Criminal Court. And this is exactly what the opposition fears, because the countries, motivated by their own interests, will try to seek and to change the results of the International Criminal Court's verdicts as a result of their political and country's interests. And as such, this type of constructive engagement that side proposition tries to state is actually countries trying to promote their own individual interests in a supposedly international body that is supposed to deliver fair justice. Yes.
Don't let side opposition say that local cultures are good in one situation, but that they're bad in the international arena. You have to make them pick one argument.
Right, so we realize that side proposition on one hand is trying to claim international equality, is trying to claim fundamental human rights, and on the other hand is making the international court stand with its arm ties behind the back, trying to follow each rule of the sovereign nation. Now you see that when side proposition is trying to fight in the name of justice, is trying to fight in the name of international criminals, side opposition would urge that side proposition get their case in order before trying to criticize the opposition. Now I'd like to move on to the positive matter of side opposition case. Firstly, that the International Criminal Court, under the model of side proposition, will infringe on local laws and customs. You see that even when there are cross-national disputes, that the International Criminal Court will have to follow international law, and that in fact is very widely different from local laws and customs from these two countries, or even more countries. And so you see that the results of these, as side opposition has already pointed out, includes making the International Criminal Court look like a Western proxy. You see that with applying international law that was made before many African countries became independent, that was made before China gained its United Nations seat, you see that international law is not applicable in many parts of the world simply because they weren't part of the decision-making process. So you see then side proposition is applying this law across borders, on all these cross-national cases, and this holds a tremendous risk of making the ICC look like not an international body like it should be, but an applier of rules made by Western nations. And in fact, this as we have shown you, has detrimental effects, including making polio aid workers in Pakistan being shot simply because Pakistanis feel that these are invaders of their countries and Western proxies and not trying to help other countries, and polio has in fact risen in Pakistan, and so you see that side proposition's plan will only make this tension and this image worse. Now I'd like to move on to the second point, that state sovereignty should be protected, because side opposition realizes that without the fundamental state sovereign right of determining what is justice in their own land and their Supreme Court, we see that there will be anarchy as a result of the fact that the government no longer holds legitimacy to its own people, and when you consider the fact that anarchy leads to more death, more violence, and more flagrant violations of international and any other law possible, you see that side opposition also holds extreme impact and outweighs any positive benefits side proposition can claim to hold. And now finally, on the third argument, that the International Criminal Court will be turned into a political tool, because strong countries will be able to use their the expanded ICC to further their interests in economics, trade, and other sectors where they may be a violation of any law. And what better way for the US and China to assert their dominance and power than to make themselves the voices of the justice in their International Criminal Court? You see that with the examples we have brought up, that this is just the perfect way for strong powers to continue to oppress. And so for all these reasons, side opposition is proud to oppose.
Thank you. Okay, ending the constructive speeches on side proposition, we call for the third speaker.
In the world of the opposition, justice is not universal. In the world of the opposition, people, based on their customs, should not be held to a similar standard. But on side proposition, we say, what about basic human rights violations? What about the treaties for international law that many different nations across the world, in fact, the majority of nations across the world, have signed? We are proud to propose because we believe that these treaties and basic human rights should be upheld and must be upheld, and the best means by which to do this is the International Criminal Court. This is why we are proud to propose. In my speech, I will begin with a rebuttal of the opposition's case, and then I will be moving on to the two main clash points of this debate. Firstly, what is the importance of expanding the ICC? And secondly, how does this impact sovereignty? Now for rebuttal. Firstly, they were challenging our models. They said, firstly, more international criminal tribunals are great. So this is exactly what our model proposes. We are proposing to expand international criminal tribunals, which, by the way, are affiliated and a branch of the International Criminal Court, which means that they basically fold into what we said, and they support our case in that. Secondly, they said that the International Criminal Court should be accepting appeals from sovereign nation, and they said that this was a contradiction of what we stated, because then how will international rights be upheld, or international law be upheld? They're ignoring one of the very first things that we laid out in our model, and basically chose to overstep this when speaking, or maybe they didn't catch it. And this is that we said that if there is a violation of international law or human rights abuses, this will absolutely always take precedence over that sovereign nation's laws, because usually sovereign nations have signed on to these treaties. Human Rights Declaration was signed by, I think it is almost every single country in the entire world. So first, that is what will be upheld, and that is what they're failing to realize our model has already addressed. Secondly, they were saying, in response to our point about first fairness, they said that it's not going to be fair, again, because of the whole sovereign law contradiction with human rights, which I just answered, that the model addressed in the very first speech, what they seem to ignore. Secondly, they said that there's no reason that it will be more effective in the future. Our point was about the fact that it is already a more effective system than many justice systems within countries. They have more thorough investigation, they are less biased because it is an international judging panel similar to the one that we see today, which means that all perspectives are brought into cases. Again, and then, furthermore, they again claimed that the international criminal tribunals were not affiliated with the international criminal courts, which is flat out false, that those are actually a brand of the International Criminal Court, so they cannot claim this. Furthermore, they said that this will not be causing constructive engagement because it will be giving certain countries a bias, but all countries will be encouraged to be collaborative on these issues. When there are international criminals, as we've seen in the past, like with the Nuremberg trials, countries were collaborating to find the best solution. It wasn't just, oh, this punishment is right, this punishment from the Western world is exactly how we're going to go, because there were multiple nations conferring on the best way to answer to these human rights abuses. And then lastly, they said that it will be used as a political tool, and there will be a Western bias. But we have a few different things in response to this. Firstly, the Western bias is improving. Secondly, they must prove that there is a distinct harm from any sort of bias at all. Certain biases aren't actually biases that are being used. What they're doing is they're picking and choosing from different nations' policies in the International Criminal Court to figure out which one best deals with what's happening. What international law has been violated, and what is the best answer to this? They can't claim that every single policy enacted by the International Criminal Court is based on a Western bias. Maybe there are some that are based on an Eastern bias, because certain nations have more practice with dealing with certain infringements of the law. And finally, the opposition offers us with no way in which we can address international criminals, like Edward Snowden, like the people who were perpetrators of the Holocaust, like Nazis. They give us no solution, no other option aside from the International Criminal Court. So in their world, what are we left with? They said, maybe we can reserve the International Criminal Court for international criminal tribunals. Great, they support our entire case. So in that way, you must support the proposition.
On that point, ma'am.
Sure, yes.
I would like to point out that the opposition's plan was to reserve the International Criminal Court for flagrant human rights violations, and that we do not support the rest of them.
We are supporting expanding this so that we can better deal with violations throughout the entire world, and also so that other cases, like we laid out in our model, like things that cross international borders, like Edward Snowden, like the Nazis who fled from Germany, those need to be addressed within an international criminal court, because where else are they going to be addressed? We don't need countries fighting like 4-year-olds over a toy to see who gets to prosecute a certain criminal. We need a collaborative effort, and that is what the International Criminal Court gives you. Now onto the two main points of clash in this debate. Firstly, what is the importance of expanding the ICC? The opposition says, again and again, that the ICC is bad because we will be infringing on local customs. Firstly, they're assuming that every single case of, as our second speaker brought up, Peter and John are stealing from each other. No international criminal court is going to take that seriously, and no one's going to spend the time appealing a stupid case like that to the International Criminal Court, because obviously this is reserved to deal with the most serious cases in the world. Furthermore, there's a lot to deal with in the importance of expanding the International Criminal Court. They're ignoring the fact that we need a way to deal with asylum seekers, like the Shah of Iran, like Edward Snowden, like Julian Assange. We need a way for countries to collaborate together so that at least they'll be prosecuted somehow. For Edward Snowden, we're seeing no prosecution, no real reaction to what he's done other than, sure, you can chill out in Russia for a year. We need real concrete ways for the international community to come together and agree on what is the most important thing to do. Additionally, they have not really answered that this is already a more effective system than certain countries' judicial systems. For example, a more thorough investigation, a 2-year-long investigation was done to deal with the Nuremberg trials. This clearly is the most effective and unbiased system. They claim, and again, this was the best way to deal with the horrible human rights abuses of Rwanda and Yugoslavia. This course has the least possible bias and no political motivation. For example, political motivation is seen in the Russian criminal court, where Putin's political prisoners are being imprisoned really for what is seemingly very suspect evidence. And the way that this could be appealed is if the man who is imprisoned appeals to the International Criminal Court saying, this is unjust, this is why we need the criminal court. And secondly, our main clash point is, how does this impact sovereignty? We have a few different ways in which this impacts sovereignty, this whole idea of the International Criminal Court. Firstly, there is not a specific issue where one country's sovereignty will be repeatedly violated. This is the entire world working together. The entire world has to say, okay, you can prosecute this criminal because this is what happened and we need help. So this doesn't mean that one country's sovereignty will be flagrantly violated. This means that everyone is agreeing that in certain cases that come to prosecuting criminals, everyone will give this up to an international arena. Secondly, every single country can be involved. That is the nature of which this court was created, an international criminal court. Every country can have a say. And then third, some countries already have given up their sovereignty in joining the ICC, which means that this hasn't historically been much of an issue. And then lastly, this is a necessity when addressing cases, as I have said, with criminals who have violated international law or crossed borders to seek asylum. We need to have a way to answer these disputes between countries over who gets to deal with what, who is prosecuting this person. You know, really, we needed that again in the Nuremberg trials. Who gets to prosecute the Nazis? The Nazis violated everything about the Jewish people. What one nation would be able to address this when the Jewish people are spread out across borders? We need something where everyone can come together, and we need to expand this, which is why if you support the prosecution of international criminals, maybe who have not necessarily inflicted on human rights, but them too, then you must propose resolution, resolution.
Thank you very much. Okay, ending the constructive speeches for this debate, we would call Op. Third.
It has gotten very heated in this debate, and even hotter in this room. But we're going to look today at what this debate boils down to. We'll be examining 3 areas of clash. First, the role of the ICC. Second, the issue of justice. And lastly, international politics. Now first, on the role of the ICC. Both sides agree that the goal of the ICC should be to correct human rights abuses. But there's this distinction between both sides. If you look at the resolution, which last time I checked says that ICC has the power over any cases, they have to give us some kind of ground in this debate. So we are protecting human rights abuses, and we are preventing human rights abuses through the ICC, but they have to defend all cases. And look at the resolution, like they say that we're only gonna have the ICC after it's gone through the system, after it's gone through the highest appeals and courts. But the ICC is still given complete authority to go into countries. And so they have not answered how the ICC still has unlimited power over these governments to come into these countries because they're giving complete authority. Now they have this plan. However, they have to give us some ground in this debate, and most importantly, they say the UNDHR is not binding for them. However, the UNDHR is very important, and the opposition's plan clearly states that the ICC will follow the UNDHR. And so ultimately, we are following, the opposition is following the UNDHR and preserving morality in a non-biased fashion. Because ultimately, the UNDHR is signed by all the organizations in the world and can't be swayed. They cannot claim any unique benefits with flagrant human rights abuse on the issue of plans because for the role of the ICC, the opposition had clearly stated that we are going to prevent human rights abuse. So examples like the Nazis, which is a tragic example, will not occur again because the ICC can be used by the opposition, but not for every case, which the opposition must defend. If you look at the resolution, they have to debate the resolution. Now, moving on to the role of the ICC. Again. We believe that we need to reserve this for human rights abuses, and the proposition says we need to use it for human rights abuses also. But we have different unique burdens, and their burden is to defend the motion. And so ultimately, we are fulfilling our burdens, and the proposition is not. They say that the ICC will be effective. First of all, they have only had one conviction ever in the status quo because they're trying to solve all these problems at once. Second, the ICC delegitimizes itself by creating a Western proxy, by going in and in every case, trying to invade and put their own standards in. And so by only reserving the ICC for specific drastic measures, we ultimately keep the legitimacy, the side opposition keeps the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court. They say that the International Criminal Court, they even conceded it as a bad track record, but they say it has potential. It doesn't have potential if it's only convicted one person in all of its history because it's trying to deal with so much.
On that point.
No, thank you, yes.
You still have not addressed the issue of international criminals who may not have violated human rights abuses. For example, like Edward Snowden, people who are seeking asylum. What on earth
so is privacy, first of all, is it a violation of human rights? And second of all, I'll get to this in the issue of international politics. All right. They also say that, like, they give the examples of the Nuremberg trial. This is not unique to the proposition. You can disregard this example. And they say that the ICC will be effective somehow in a utopia where they don't convict just one person. But even if it is effective, this destroys sovereignty, this destroys culture, this destroys the ICC's own legitimacy, and so you cannot buy their effectiveness argument. So we clearly outweigh, and side opposition best represents the role of the International Criminal Court in this world. Now on the issue of justice. What side opposition tells you is that the International Criminal Court should not be just a political tool. For example, US and China can use this as their major world powers to assert their version of justice, their perverted version of justice, on the rest of the world. This is not right, and this is what the proposition would have you vote on. Also, side proposition claims that we need to be more fair through the ICC because all people are equal. We agree that all people are equal, but the best justice is through one's own people, through one's own customs. Also, look at our plan. We are not disregarding human rights abuses. Let me make that very clear. In our plan, we use the ICC to stop flagrant human rights abuses, but we don't overuse the ICC so it delegitimizes, so it creates Western proxies in which the Eastern world kills people from the UN, from the ICC, because they're sick of these governments and these organizations coming in and telling them what to do. And also, they're assuming that the International Court will be unbiased just because it has the word international in it. There are countries like the UN, like the US, like China, that can insert their beliefs, that can assert their dominance over the rest of the world. And so, in fact, the US paid off the ICC, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, so that they would not use evidence against their members, against the United States like generals. And so ultimately, we've shown in the past how there has been bias, and all that the proposition is talking about is a utopia in which the ICC will actually convict people, which has only been done once, and in which the ICC will be fair and not account for the actual real world in which there is power struggles and increased power. The final proposition argument is that we need to stop division. However, international countries will jockey for power in the International Criminal Court. And so ultimately, they're not stopping division. In fact, the proposition said that there's always going to be international tension. So why should we create another platform for international tension? That is not a good way to go for this world. And lastly, on the issue of international politics. Side opposition is clearly delineated how there's a proxy of Western invaders and this issue of people, governments and organizations from the West coming in and telling people how they should live their lives, telling people how they should work their governments. And this has even led to deaths, as in the example of Pakistan, in which the people there were sick of the ICC, sick of organizations from outside coming and telling them how to live their lives and changing their customs. And so this actually led to death. And they asked for an example, we gave them one. Okay. Also, on the issue of the political tool. Again, the US, China, Russia, they can use the ICC as a stage to put their own positions, and we cannot allow these powerful nations to tell us what justice is. You would agree?
No, not at all. Our model says that either there is a violation of international law, like the example of stoning women, in which case the ICC would be bound. I didn't get to the or.
Okay, but we heard the model.
No, you didn't.
Okay, let's talk about this model again. I mean, okay, they talk about the stoning of like a woman. First of all, we have the ICC like on flagrant human rights abuses. I don't need to hear any more of that argument. We've heard it again and again. It's not relevant to this debate because the ICC would solve flagrant human rights abuses. Also, on the issue, again, back to the point of international politics. When there's no law, when there's contradictions, there's anarchy, there's mass killing, as we've seen in Pakistan. And so, what does the proposition have to argue? Constructive engagement? They say we're going to stop division of countries by what? Providing them another platform for international attention? No, that is not the right way to solve international problems and create 2 countries or 3 countries or 4 countries that are at the top of the world fighting for power in the international criminal courts, giving amnesty to their own country as we've seen in the past. And finally, let's compare the 2 worlds. On the proposition, you have an ICC that first of all is not unique to the oppositions and does not solve every case and does not consider every case. So first of all, they're not even relating to their burden or the resolution. And on the opposition, you have an organization that comes in when it's needed and does not create a Western proxy that ultimately leads to more death. So therefore, this motion must fall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now now ask for the reply speaker of team opposition to end the debate on their side.
This debate today has gotten very messy. So let's examine this debate and try to clean it up, starting with 4 main principles identified throughout this debate. Now let's see principles and then apply them into the real life through pragmatic analysis, and then we'll see how through these 4 principles, side opposition has clearly won today's debate. Now let's focus on the first principle first of all, on the question of justice. Now, justice seems to be a very important topic, yet side proposition refuses to acknowledge that their plan doesn't guarantee justice. Now we see that they would put sovereign nations' law in the International Criminal Court when there is no international law to govern the International Criminal Court. Yet, of course, we all realize that international law only goes as far as human rights. And so when you move beyond human rights towards things like where there are more gray areas, you see that sovereign nation rights laws are still implemented. And that the UN only goes as far as the Declaration of Human Rights in international law, and that you see going beyond that, side proposition is still not delivering justice. And yet, you realize even more when side opposition states that the ICC will implement the international law for flagrant human rights abuses. So we see the identical portions on proposition and opposition for justice on flagrant human rights abuses, yet proposition adds this additional stipulation that in fact does not guarantee justice for all peoples of all races, and in fact it depends on where your feet stand and where you're born, and side opposition believes that this is incredibly wrong. But not only that, we see that in justice, side proposition believes that just because you have an international jury means you'll receive a fair verdict. But then again, I'm sure an Iranian wouldn't want a US person sitting on their verdict, that a Cuban wouldn't want a United States person sitting on their verdict, that a Japanese woman wouldn't want a Chinese man sitting on their verdict. You see that international tensions proliferate and invade courts, and that they believe that just because international means no bias is completely wrong. Now let's move on to the second principle of sovereignty. Yet again, when side proposition responds nil at all to the fact that when international criminal courts, their model is implemented, it means delegitimizing countries, creating anarchy, meaning that countries and their sovereign rights are violated and that laws are no longer followed in any land. And we see that this is incredibly dangerous and something that side proposition just conveniently ignores, because simply that their plan would create anarchy around governments and sovereign entities around the world. Now we see that even on bias, we see again that though side proposition seems to believe that there's no bias in the International Criminal Court, side opposition has given you concrete examples and international tensions that proliferate currently around the world to show you that bias will exist in the International Criminal Court. And in fact, justice is better served when you are being judged by your own people and not by foreigners who judge you by your race or by what your country did before. And that does not create true justice, and that does not eliminate bias on side proposition. Now finally, let's move on to the principle of effectiveness and see that how that impacts real life pragmatics. We see that effectiveness in fact has not been proven by side proposition simply because they raise examples that are either outdated before the ICC was founded, and because their only causal link is that expansion leads to better efficiency. And we see that that is simply not the case when the ICC at its current size could only convict one person out of the hundreds of warlords that were new to have committed flagrant human rights abuses, and yet side proposition believes that this would actually work. So it's not effective at all, and thank goodness it isn't effective too, because if it was, it would create global anarchy, it would violate all countries' sovereignty, it would give a perverted version of justice to world citizens, different versions of justice depending on where you are from and what you look like. And so we believe as side opposition that this motion must be opposed. And so therefore side opposition stands here in the firmest regard that this motion has to be opposed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ending the debate, we call for the reply speaker team proposition.
Is everyone good? Okay. As side proposition, we also believe that this debate has been unnecessarily messy. But the way to talk about it is not to look at different principles that are interacting. We need to most fundamentally look at two different worlds that are being described. There are many similarities and there are several differences. But only those differences will ultimately matter. So first, let's get rid of all the similarities. Let's make those clear. There will be several things in both worlds that exist no matter what, such as in both cases flagrant human rights abuses will be gotten rid of and taken care of by the ICC. Local disputes will be initially sent to the courts that are in the local places, and sovereignty is respected initially. What's problematic is that all of side opposition's arguments, their substantive arguments, deal with things in the common ground. They say that we need to preserve local culture, we need to preserve sovereignty, but these things, in most cases, and only with the exception, and two exceptions which I will get to, are going to be preserved. This is not going away in the proposition's world. There are only two cases where this will happen. Let's look at them now. In our world, local laws and sovereignty are respected, except for in human rights abuses. Not flagrant ones, let's be clear. They use the example of a woman being stoned as a way that we have to maintain the local culture. That would not be prosecuted in world opposition. In world proposition, we say that we need a basic level of rights abuses, such as threatening your life, such as stoning a woman, that they will be able to appeal. Because we are about balance. We're about balancing the local cultures with a basic level of rights that every single person deserves. So since they use that as their example, that's the kind of thing that is the difference. The local laws will be respected when we're talking about tax evasion or people stealing from each other. But when it's affecting your life and your ability to live as a person, such as being stoned, that's what will change. The second case is in the case of an unfair trial. If there is a biased judge, if there is a bribe, if there is a political influence, such as the example my first speaker brought up with Putin and Russia getting really involved in the trials, the ICC in this case would redo it in a fair way using that country's laws. They never deal with the actual model and the nuances of it. We aren't saying that we will intervene in every case. We're saying that there are advantages to having balance between basic human rights and local cultures that they cannot have. We advocate for a check that is approved by the international community and basic things, and that's the difference. So now, from there, let's continue to the other advantages that we brought up as side proposition that they still haven't addressed. The first deals with criminals across borders. We need a way to respond to this, not just flagrant human rights abuses, but people like Edward Snowden, to which he rides off as that is a flagrant human rights abuse. That's not. That's about privacy. That's a governmental problem with giving information, and we don't have a way to solve that. We need everyone to be responsible, and we don't want to arbitrarily choose a country to prosecute these people. We need a court that can rule these types of crimes that will only increase as we have an ever more international world, such as terrorism, such as Edward Snowden. They haven't answered for that. And the second is more effective trials. The only thing that they keep coming down to is give us examples, or try to get rid of our examples by saying it's not the ICC. Well, we've given you them. The Nuremberg trial, which was part of the ICT, just given in a tribunal, was something that proved that there was more information, more focus on actually being just, more time to do it, no political pressures. This is something happening now that's happened in the past that has been successful. This trial is also, they've never responded to the fact that we get rid of political bias, because the original system doesn't have the effect. If bias exists in an international arena, if we can bribe people in the international arena, then we can definitely do it at home. We have always argued that more perspectives leads to less bias, that they cancel out, and their more eyes looking will be a better check. Because bias exists in every community, but the mechanism that we have to solve, something that makes it different than just a normal jury, is that we're in the eyes of everyone, that we have that engagement, that we have those checks. So when you look at this debate, think about the difference. Think about the certain situations when the ICC is necessary to keep that balance of local culture and to protect the basic human rights. Because they've never responded to the nuances of our model, and because we have these advantages, we urge you to propose.